I'm going to ask the first question. I think we have people with microphones in the audience who will walk around and select people for the further questions. My question is for Marvin. As I mentioned in my opening, we don't have hate speech laws in America. They're unconstitutional here. My opinion as an American is that that's a good thing. I would be against these laws even if they were constitutional. And just looking around, I don't think we need them. I think we get along fine. You know, sometimes people say things that one has an impulse, one wishes we could that there were a law against this. But on balance, I think it's fine, and I think the costs would far outweigh the benefits. So my question is, am I wrong, or is there something about America that sets it apart from your country and other Western democracies that you need them and we don't? And I think the speaker should come up to the lectern because I don't think the microphones on the tables are working. So please come up and.
This is an area, I think, in which reasonable people can disagree. The Americans and the United States obviously has a very, very different legal tradition than a number of other countries. Canada kind of is a hybrid legal system somewhere between the American and the British system. Whether it works for the states, I mean, America is a wonderful democracy. I think Canada is a wonderful democracy as well. The question is, are they effective, and whether the balance is right. Erwin Kotler has talked about Canadian Supreme Court decisions that have talked about how Canadian hate speech laws balance the rights to freedom of speech and the rights of minorities to be free from hate speech, from incitement, considering that we've seen that hate speech can lead to some of the most egregious acts in history. So I'm not ducking the question because I don't think I'm going to convince too many Americans that something as basic as the First Amendment is wrong. What I will say is that different approaches work. In Canada, for example, hate speech laws had an important role in the 1990s in dealing with the resurgent neo-Nazi movement. It was something that was real and that seemed to be happening, and hate speech laws, a number of prosecutions under hate speech laws had a very important role, both in teaching people about the fact that there is a resurgent neo-Nazi movement, that Holocaust denial is part of anti-Semitism, and in nipping it in the bud. So it had, I believe, a helpful role in that regard. The concern is, are hate speech laws, and it seems to me still the greater concern is the use of lawfare libel lawsuits stifling freedom of speech. Is it stifling the right to criticize? In Canada, only 2 Islamist kinds of cases have made their way through. The one against Ezra Levant was dropped because the guy who made the complaint was humiliated ultimately by it. Now, the hate speech law should change in that the guy who made a vexatious complaint should pay Levant's costs for having gone through it. The Alberta Human Rights Commission should have reacted in the same way that the Alberta Police Department reacted under the Criminal Code, which is to say this has got nothing to do with us. The Alberta Human Rights Commission should have done the same thing, but they dithered, which is a problem. But at the end of the day, they did not send the case to a hearing. And the only other such case, the Stein case, I talked about, was a ringing endorsement for freedom of speech, for the right to raise these concerns. So the concerns are still there. I was going to talk about what I think are necessary procedural changes that need to take place in Canadian hate speech laws, particularly human rights laws. But if those kinds of procedural changes take place, then I think they're at least compatible with democracy.
Thank you. All right. Okay, Douglas would like to say a word, and then Erwin, and then we'll go to the audience.
Sorry, can I just pick up on that very quickly? I obviously couldn't disagree more with that. Just so the problem the Canadian, I stick by the, no, I won't use kangaroo courts again, I mean Mickey Mouse courts of Canada in this regard have done, is that before Stein came along, there was a 100% conviction rate of these courts for people found for hate speech. Now, any court that can be that would be the case. I mean, you'd have to go back to Maoist China to find a set of courts that had a 100% conviction rate. The idea that Canada in the 1990s was hurtling towards becoming a Nazi state is preposterous, utterly preposterous. And what you see in the Canadian human rights tribunals is a great example of what goes wrong with government. Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s sent one of her civil servants away once and said, go and deal with this particular problem. He came back a week later and said, I set up a department to deal with the problem. And she said, I asked you to deal with the problem, not to make it worse. Now you set up a department, the problem will never be solved. The Canadian Human Rights Commissioners have no desire to wipe out hatred, because if that did happen, they'd be out of a job. So they go around trying to find it. That's why half of the people on one of these neo-Nazi websites, I think there were 11 people on one of them, half of them were working for the Canadian Human Rights Tribunals. This is a preposterous situation that has come up, and it is a great example of what goes wrong with government. When you put these institutions in place and allow them free rein, they will keep on going. They will be waiting to find the last teenage dropout sitting writing on some neo-Nazi website in his mum's basement. They'll be going after that guy. But when there's a cleric or a hate speech speaker coming from Europe or the Muslim world, or indeed is in Canada doing this stuff, they'll do nothing to deal with him. And finally on this, to say that because Mark Stein was not eventually prosecuted or found guilty for this article is preposterous. As he has said himself, the process is the punishment. It's the fact that you lose a year or two of your life in having to answer to these government-appointed offence takers. It's the fact that you have to spend six-figure sums defending yourself for an article you once wrote. This is not a victory. And finally, to say, well, you've been on both sides of it. Yeah, you've been on the receiving end of this, and you've been behind such a case. Please, I really wish that people who use that as an argument would just realise most of us, most journalists and others, do not want to spend our lives justifying why we once felt that we could say something that is true in a Canadian newspaper or anywhere else. That is not freedom of speech. That is a preposterous violation of it. Thank you.
All right, Owen, we'll have a word and then we'll go to the audience.
Okay, just a remark. I'm not going to engage on the issue of human rights commissions, but on the broader point that you brought up, James, and that is on the overarching issue of free speech in a constitutional democracy. Let's face it, every constitutional democracy operates out of a certain legal culture or culture that is unique to it. And therefore I will say that common to both the US and Canada and other constitutional democracies, there is no such thing as absolute free speech, and I will stand behind it. There are different categories that are excluded, and I say this as a free speech person. I speak now as to the law. There are certain categories that are excluded in the US Constitution. It may be obscenity, fighting words. In Canada, it may be hate speech. But the basic principle here is that while endorsing, as I say, the notion that liberty in these things as free speech is no less vital to man than breathing is to its physical existence, we do have these limitations. Now, let me just conclude by saying, what were the grounds that the Supreme Court of Canada, in all its free speech cases, held with respect to regulating hate speech? Just one-liners to sum it up. Number one, that hate speech, and with all the limitations that that constituted an assault on the underlying values of free speech, the search for truth, promotion of democracy, autonomy of the individual. Second, that it was an assault on the values of a free and democratic society. And here, James, the big difference between the US and Canada is we do not look at free speech as just a speech issue. We look at it as an equality issue. We look at it as a human dignity issue. And so other values were brought into it. Third thing is that you had to look at the right of minorities to protection against group vilifying speech, and the Supreme Court brought in what it called the harms-based rationale, showing empirical data regarding the injurious and prejudicial fallout to vulnerable, disadvantaged minorities from this kind of incited hate speech. And finally, yes, in Canada, we are different than what John Bolton said. We do believe that our international law as the Supreme Court put it, is a relevant and persuasive authority, and that international law excludes hate speech from the ambit of protected speech. This has been a crude snapshot of the differences, but I just thought I ought to share it with the audience.